Hey everyone, in today's episode we're talking about Microsoft 365 security again, and I've got Paul Schnakenburg back on the show today, and we're going to be talking about malicious OAuth applications specifically. What they are they still an issue, should you be concerned, and what can you do about them? All that and more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm Podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm Podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Surwich, and I've got, surprise, Paul Schnakenburg back on the show today. How's it going, Paul?
Oh, I'm glad to be the surprise for somebody. I am good, Andy. How are you?
That's good. That's good. We keep going like this. I'm not sure it's going to be a surprise for most people, but you always have such great information to share with us. We have such good conversations. I can't not bring you on the show, So
thank you.
Especially when we're talking about the 365 space, because I start going down the 365 route on a specific topic, and I'm like, oh, I got to talk to Paul about this, So anyway. Well, our topic for today is a conversation you and I have had several times over the years, right? And I think the last time we kind of did this in a public setting, I want to say it's been 2 or 3 years, right? And we're talking about malicious OAuth apps today, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think it's been about 2 or 3 years. We did a webinar on this at one point in time, which I'm sure the information is vastly dated now, but this is still an issue, right? Yep. And so I guess as a baseline, maybe where we should start for those people that are not familiar is, what are malicious OAuth apps, right? And the way that I've always described them is, and I always describe them through the standpoint of a user in 365, right? So, okay, I'm Joe user in 365. I've got my day job, right? The organization I work for uses 365, and hey, in the marketplace or via a link somewhere, I find this nifty 365 tool that solves a problem of mine. So I'm like, cool, I want to use that, right? And so I go ahead and click install or enable, right? And it brings me to a lovely looking 365 authentication page where, everybody's seen this page, right? Like, hey, okay, this app wants access to A, B, C, X, Y, Z, your personal information, your organization, that type of stuff, right? And most users are just going to be like, oh, okay, cool, whatever, my admin's keeping me safe, and they click accept, and if the app is malicious, which is sometimes the case, the damage is done at that point, right? But very informal explanation, but you probably have a slightly more technical one than that, Paul.
I think that's pretty clear. The way people generally find these is they're looking for an Outlook add-in or a Word add-in or something like that, right? Or a web add-in of some kind, and it integrates with Office. And as you say, they are there to make the user more productive, and the user is happily going along with it. And the other important thing is that whole permission screen that comes up, right, says this app wants access to your profile and do this, that, and the other. We are so used to that because that often happens on mobile platforms, right? You're installing some app, and it says, you want to use this camera app, and it needs permissions to send email on your behalf, and you go, why does it need that? Well, it doesn't matter because I want the camera app, so I'm going to install it. And then you click OK, and off it goes, right? So we've sort of been trained to bypass those screens very quickly. And the only other thing I would add to that whole flow you had there is that that's not necessarily the way it has to be. It can be like that, but it doesn't have to be like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And whenever I'm talking about malicious OAuth apps, something that you said years ago during one of our previous discussions has always stuck with me, and that was, we have trained users to hit accept on these permission screens in order to get their jobs done, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're getting it in the workplace, they're getting it on their mobile devices. The other area where I see this type of functionality quite frequently are browser extensions as well. So if you got end users that are using browser extensions, they're used to seeing that there too. So it's certainly an area that is ripe for, well, somebody nefarious to do something, right? So, I mean, yeah, I guess the other thing that I would know about this is it's been a while since I've looked at a new tenant in 365. Last I knew, a new tenant out of the gate, the permissions for who can authorize applications and add-ins of this nature was fairly loosely defined, right? Like, it's pretty open out of the gate, last I knew.
Okay, so it has changed. So back when we did that original webinar, end users by default, if you hadn't changed anything, could authorize anything for themselves, right? So that's the important point to recognize here. Like if I'm Paul, the user, and I install an Outlook add-in and it asks for all the permissions under the sun, all it will ever get, which is not all, but what it will get is permissions to my profile. Now, if that's an Outlook add-in and it's reading my emails, sending emails on my behalf, of course, if that's malicious, that's a disaster, right? Because everybody else in the organization are going to trust me, like my email filters are going to trust me because this is coming from me, right? And it's sent as part of my profile. So that's number one. What has changed, though, is that new tenants now, as far as I know, you only get to authorize permissions that are low level. So there's essentially three levels here you can choose from, right? And the original one was everybody could do everything for their own data. Middle level is you have a set of low-level permissions that Microsoft has defined, which are deemed sort of low impact, low security impact, right? So you can read my emails, but you can't send emails on my behalf. Now, that's still a risk, but it's a
much less of a problem.
And then you have no, end users can never authorize any OAuth apps whatsoever, right? They're just blocked from it, and you need an administrator to do it. The other part of this conversation is the fact that as an administrator, you can authorize, and often have to, authorize an OAuth app tenant-wide. So instead of reading just Andy's email profile, if you have an application that is backing up Microsoft 365, right? It's going to back up everybody's mailbox, so it's going to need permissions to everybody's mailbox. So when you as an admin install that application, it's going to say, I need access to read everybody's mailbox, right? So you as an admin can then do a tenant-wide consent for that entire application.
Well, I'm glad to see that they've made some changes there, because the way it used to be was kind of a glaring security red flag, right? So it's good to know that there's at least been some changes made there, but the issue still persists because of a number of different reasons. And I guess the big question that always comes up is, well, like, how are these apps getting past Microsoft, right? Like, okay, I'm seeing them, you know, in a store somewhere. Okay, aren't these like scanned by Microsoft, or at least checked and looked into, right? And you and I were talking about this just before this call, and it's an interesting answer. So I'm going to let you go ahead.
I do want to point out one thing first before we get into that.
Sure.
This is not a theoretical attack, right? And we will get into that a bit more later on. But I do want people to understand we are not talking about it. This could be used by the bad guys. This is a good point. This has been used by the bad guys in many, many, many situations already. So that is definitely something to bear in mind, right? Like this is not a maybe. So there are three levels. So first of all, there is only one Azure Active Directory. This is one thing that people don't realize, right? There is not. You each have a tenant. Each company has a tenant, or maybe multiple tenants, but in generally one tenant in Azure Active Directory, now called Entra ID. However, there is only one Entra ID, like it's a global one for everybody. That means that if I'm a software vendor and I want to write an application that I want to provide to Andy's organization, I can put an app into my Azure AD, define it as a multi-tenant app, and then I can say to Andy, hey, you can go and use my app here, right? And we can have a a commercial relationship and you're paying me per user or however that works, right? Now, the very first level so if I just did that, when you get the permission screen, both as a user or as an administrator, and you see the list of permissions that it's asking for, you're going to see that it says unverified publisher, right? So my company, if I haven't done anything else, it's going to say unverified, right? And that's going to not be a good security signal for you. So at the very first level, I can become a certified publisher or a verified publisher. Now, when I do that, all that Microsoft is checking is that there's an actual company there. Right? I'm not pretending to be a company. I've got an actual company there. That's all they're checking, right? They're not checking the code. They're not doing any code scanning. They're not checking what permissions the app is asking for, any of that. Right?
So I could go out and open Andy's Sandwich Shop LLC, get an EIN number, which here in the States is like the tax ID number for the organization, right? At that point, the business is official, right? Yep. And that's all it would take. And then I could start making my malicious OAuth apps then, right?
Yep. Because ultimately it does come down to you. Now, I suppose what you do need to look at here is that Microsoft is trying to provide a marketplace for people to publish these OAuth apps and have the Office 365 in general become more sticky with their clients, right? And the more extensions they use, the better it is, and it's better for the software vendors, etc. So there's always a balance between, making every application have to jump through 100 hoops and having 5 applications in our app store and nobody using them,
right?
or having lots of apps, right? So that's sort of the behind the scenes here. The next level is you can do something called app certification, and that is also self-attesting. And Microsoft has in public preview an app called App Certification Tool. We'll provide links in the below or on the side, whichever platform you're in. You can read about these. That helps that gathering the information that is part of that self-attestation that your application is an okay app. In general, I would say this is a work in progress for Microsoft, and I don't think they've really found the right recipe altogether here yet.
Right, and I mean, because those two lower levels that you talked about. One, I've already talked about, like how easy it would be to get around that, really, right? But I want to go back to the unverified application first that you mentioned. Like, hey, I can publish an app to a multi-tenant application to Entra ID, right? And send it to my quote unquote customer, or if I'm a threat actor, my target. There's all kinds of mischief I could get into just with that, because all it takes is one user to authenticate, to allow that malicious app, and the damage is done, Yep. So, I mean, at that point, I've got the session token, and I can, gain access to that user's information. I can attempt to make lateral movement, get privilege escalation. At that point, I'm off to the races as the threat actor.
Absolutely. And to be clear, right, not only do you have the session token, you have those permissions as that app. And that's important because the principle now is the app, which means that even if you're using MFA for your account, even if you reset your password, right, those permissions still persist with the app. So it still has access, like forever, until you delete that app or give it less permissions.
And that's the thing, right? Because the administrators would have to determine that, hey, there's something going on, there's something strange, and then they would have to actually go in, locate, hey, there's this strange app that's authenticated to our tenant, and actually take action to remove it from the tenant. I mean, there's a sequence of events that has to happen there, and that's, I don't know about you, I don't know how often I go in and actually look at my application list in 365, right? And now, granted, the tenants that I've worked in are, what I would call the SMB and SME size, right? But maybe if you're an enterprise level and you've got somebody managing OAuth apps, maybe it's a different story. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, well, we'll get back to mitigation a little bit later.
Yep, that's a good point. And I think before we get into the prevention and the mitigation, right, I kind of want to step into like an example, right? We kind of already gave a little bit of an example of how to bypass Microsoft's checking of these applications, right? But just to kind of give a concrete example of what this could look like, I want to spend some time looking at the Well phishing kit. Now, Well is spelled W3LL. I believe I'm saying it right. You'll have to ask
very elite of them. Yep, go on.
Right, exactly. But this is your traditional adversary in the middle style attack, and kind of the same thing like Paul has mentioned. I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes to some resources for this so you can read some more. But basically, what the Well phishing kit does is it allows threat actors to basically set up a reverse proxy to 365's authentication mechanisms. Now, you could pose this reverse proxy as a malicious OAuth app, right? That would be the entry point for the attack chain, right? Like, hey, here's this nifty app. It sends the user to a landing page that me as the threat actor, I control, and really it's this reverse proxy. Now, what this phishing kit does is this reverse proxy simply sits in between the end user and 365. And as far as 365 is concerned, the authentication process is completing. That reverse proxy actually forwards through the end user's credentials to 365, and then 365 spits out the session token, which the reverse proxy captures, and then they send that back through the end user, and the end user's none the wiser, right? So I guess the threat here is twofold in this example, because not only, like you said, explained earlier, Paul, do the app permissions persist if I did indeed set this up as a malicious OAuth app, but now I also have a legit session token that I can utilize for as long as it's present as well too. So now I have two possible avenues into the organization. And again, to what your point that you mentioned earlier, Paul, is that this completely sidesteps MFA. Completely sidesteps MFA, which, some people in the industry would have you think that's the magic silver bullet for all our security issues. It's a fantastic tool, don't get me wrong, but it's not infallible. So,
no, it's not.
Again, just kind of a concrete example of what this could look like. But let's get to kind of the more, I guess, useful for our audience stuff, right? And that is the mitigation and prevention, right, Paul? And I mean, the first thing that always comes up is like, well, we just won't use OAuth applications. And, well, I guess you could do that, sure, and maybe in some high security environments, maybe that's the policy, and that makes sense. Yeah. But for every organization, that probably is not the case. So what do you think in terms of mitigation and prevention? What would be your recommendation, Paul?
Right. So as listeners will know by now, if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, I also run my own business, and I've got a small handful of clients whom I manage all their IT for, including their OAuth apps. So my classic client here is a small school, say 125 odd users, say 100 students and 25 staff roughly. Here at this client, I have blocked them installing OAuth apps altogether. So I simply do not allow them to do it.
Gotcha.
I simply have the workflow that's built into M3ID, so anybody can turn this on. You don't need any extra licensing for this, where when they want to install an OAuth app, up comes a message saying you don't have permissions to install this. You need to ask your administrator. And in the past, back when we did that webinar, there was no link to anything. Like the user would have to know that they would have to call me and say, hey, I'm trying to install application XYZ. Right. Can you authorize it, please? Now what happens is I get an email saying user so-and-so wants to install application so-and-so. I can then click on that link, go into M3ID, see what permissions the app is asking for, and I can then allow that installation for just that user, or I can block it. right, for just that user and say no. Or I can block it for the entire tenant. If I see that, hey, this app is really not something I want anybody else to ask for either, I can just block it outright for the entire tenant forever until I remove the block. So that's very nice. Oh, and I can also, if I see that it's an app that looks like it would be really useful for the organization and it looks legit and it's not asking for too many permissions, whatever, I can actually do an admin consent at that point and authorize it for the entire tenant so that any other user who, that user says, hey, you can go and use this app. It's great, right? When they try to install it, it just installs because it's been admin consented for the tenant. Right. So that's how I manage it at that client. And that's one of the benefits of the SMB space because, 125 users, I probably get an email, average maybe once every couple of weeks, something like that. So that's a manageable workload for me, right? Yeah. Now, like if you had 100,000 users in your organization, you're going to need a little different. Have some dedicated people to manage that, right? So that's number one. Now, number two, Entra ID does have some built-in protections. So if you go to any app that is registered in Azure AD, in Entra ID, you can.
It's a hard habit to get out of.
It is. It's going to take a while. You can look at what permissions been granted to the application, whether it's user or admin consent, and you can also then say there's like 4 levels. I think you can say, I'm a bit suspicious of this application, where you can run some scripts to identify what the app is doing. You can say, I think this application is malicious. And then you can go through and remove permissions from it. And then the final level is, this application is definitely malicious. And then it's got a bunch of steps you need to take there, and you can run PowerShell scripts and stuff. So, but getting to that point that you're suspicious of the application, there's no real help there, short of reading a blog article online somewhere that somebody tells you this is a malicious app, or some other signal coming from some other security tool.
Right.
So the step up from that is, and that's where the human review comes in. Now, the step up from that is the Defender for Cloud apps. So either if you have standalone licensing for Microsoft's CASB, Defender for Cloud apps, or you have Microsoft 365 E5, you get Defender for Cloud apps, which is a huge security cloud-based firewall, let's call it. And one of the things it does is it tracks OAuth app usage. And you can build policies around it, and you can have alerts come in. So you got much more visibility and much more control. On top of that, they recently released something called App Governance. And App Governance looked like it was going to be an add-on, and then it actually just got included. So if you have Microsoft Defender for Cloud apps, you can simply turn on App Governance. And if you do, you get some additional features for OAuth apps, including it shows you exactly the risky permissions. So you can sort your apps per risky permissions, and you can go and investigate which user is using the app, how much data they're transferring up and down from the app. Right. And you get all this really nice visibility. And again, you can do these very granular policies around controlling this. So that's the sort of ultimate in mitigation, I suppose. But I think the basic thing here for any listener who is an administrator of a Microsoft 365 tenant is, this is not something you can ignore, right? Like, you do need to be aware that your users are going to install these applications. And I suppose the one thing I was going to say, I did read online somewhere, somebody said, oh, this registration of apps in Azure AD, it's not secure enough. And I'm like, well, for 20 years, we had Active Directory on premises, and there's no registration of applications, right? Like, the Active Directory doesn't do registration. Like, there's nowhere in a traditional on-premises Windows network with Windows Server where you could see what applications were actually running on your network with any of the built-in tools, because there is no registration whatsoever. So the fact that we actually have it in Entra ID, I think, is a step up, right? At least you have some visibility for anything that talks to any of the APIs that make up Entra ID and all these other APIs. You see what apps are registered for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you bring that up too, because it's like, we think about the old on-premises world, and it sounds like the old Wild West now. I'm thinking about how we used to do things, and just like any app could run on any endpoint for the most part, right? Unless you were getting really fancy with group policy and really locking things down, which then brings back the whole manageability and scalability discussion, right? But again, we're not talking about on-premises. I'm just reminiscing at this stage. So
we both do, mate. We're getting old.
I know.
That's the reality.
I know. Indeed. So I'm glad you brought up the Defender for Cloud Apps, and you mentioned the CASB solution as well too, because we did an episode where we talked about licensing security features in 365. So I'll be sure to link that in the show notes as well, folks, because that's an interesting one. Because we hear about these tools in the 365 stack, and sometimes it's not as simple as just going and flipping them on. You need to figure out how you're going to license it first. So I'll be sure to link that in the show notes as well too. So with that, Paul, I think what I want to spend the rest of our time on, the couple of minutes we have left here, I want to spend some time talking about the 365 Essential Companion Guide that you authored and we just released not that long ago, I don't think it was. And the reason I bring that up is because we actually covered OAuth applications. Well, I should say you covered OAuth applications in that ebook to quite a large degree, if I remember correctly, right?
That is accurate. Before I forget, I do want to make one more call to action on the mitigation side for any organization. I forgot before. So don't forget about it. Don't imagine that it's not concerning you. But secondly, do go in and set, if you can't turn it off altogether, right, and have administrators authorize every single application, at least go in and set the level of permissions that you deem low impact. So Microsoft has a default set. You could just grab those and say, well, any user who tries to install an application that is only asking for these permissions, or those or less, they can be authorized by an end user. You can do that, or you can create your own custom set of low permissions, right? So you could say, in my organization, only these permissions are okay. So you can trim down Microsoft's ones, you can add ones to other APIs, however you want to manage that. And we should also mention that this is also to do with group apps, which literally is Teams add-ins, right? Which is probably one of the most popular OAuth applications. So you can also have a group owner, meaning a team owner, be allowed to authorize apps in their team, right? You can go into Teams and add an app, and then it can show up in tabs at the top or whatever. Those things can also be controlled using this permission. So go and look at that set of permissions so that you get it right for your tenant. Now, coming back to the Microsoft 365 Essentials Companion Guide. So this is like version 3. We've had this a few versions now. And it's not specifically security focused. It's more on how do I manage a Microsoft 365 tenant as a time-strapped admin who doesn't have time to really cover it all. And it's got lots and lots of chapters. And one of the things we do look at is OAuth applications. And so if you want to read about it rather than having to try to interpret us talking about it in a podcast, it's a good download. And the kicker is it's completely free. So
it is. And I will be sure to put that at the top of the resources list for this episode, folks. So you've got that. It's a great companion guide. And like you said, it covers far more than just what we've talked about today. We've spent this episode talking about OAuth applications, malicious OAuth applications, I should say. But Paul talks about that and a ton more inside of this ebook. It's a nice piece of content, a lot of value in there. So, well, Paul, I want to say thank you for spending some time with us, talking to us about malicious OAuth applications today, and also for authoring the 365 Essential Companion Guide. So always great talking to you, my friend. So thanks for being here.
Likewise.
And
I hope this is useful for our listeners. And
definitely.
I hope they go and check their permissions for OAuth apps and what users can do.
I hope so. Right? That's hopefully the gets everybody thinking about that, because I feel like people take OAuth apps for granted. They just take it for granted. They don't really think about the permissions they're giving away, right? Even administrators at times, right? So we've all become conditioned to those permission screens in some way, shape, or form. So anyway. Well, with that, folks, thanks for spending some time with us. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We're available out on YouTube and all of the major podcasting platforms. So wherever you feel like listening or watching us, you can probably find us out there somewhere. So be sure to, like I said, hit subscribe. We are available out on the socials. So I will include links to the social media handles for Paul and myself in the show notes as well. And with that, hope to see you again for a future episode. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. We'll catch you again next time. See you later.